Fine artists in the field of sculpture could benefit from other industries that make molds, such as those who make making molds for industries like the automobile industry, the naval shipyard industries, and the aerospace industries. Whether you're making a wood pattern or a flexible artist mold, the registration is the most important part of the mold. And for the artists and foundries that make these molds, is the most neglected part of the mold. What I bring to you is to show you how to make a perfect registration every time so that your mold fits together and there's no deflection or distortion in the mold. Deflection is when the mold bends and twists, causing distortion. And perfect registration so that both halves fit together seamlessly and perfectly. Your basic mold components are the shell casing, the flange, and the registration keys. For my pattern making supplies, I often use Freeman Manufacturing Supply Company. For those perfect registration walls I showed you, I use the Freeman sheet wax. It is very inexpensive and very cost effective to use in producing your fiberglass layup molds. For this mold, I used the 165 sheet wax firm translucent 1/4 inch thick from Freeman. Here it is as I pull it out of the box. You can see that it's firm and translucent. And it's easy to cut with a hot knife and easy to bend along the shape of your mold. This mold I'll be using a urethane for the mold material. So I'll amply coat it with Freeman wax release. I'll put at least 5 coats of this on, let it dry in between each coat and buff the coats down thoroughly. I have to overemphasize it's important to turn your sculpture upside down and around. Get all the nooks and crannies underneath very well, especially if you're pouring with urethane. Now I'm determining my parting line, just giving it a little bit of thought. The head is turned at a different axis than the body, so this is going to determine how the mold is going to pull out. So I'm going to have to add 1 extra piece of mold so that the mold can pull straight off from the nose without bending the nose. So there I'm positioning the wax, thinking about how I'm going to align it and wrap it around the figure. I use a ruler to visualize the parting line. Parting line is crucial if you want to get a good reproduction. I place the wax under the figure and draw a line with the pen, with the marker. You can also do this with a piece of cardboard if you don't want to risk wasting the wax. And with a hot knife, I trim the wax to conform to the figure. I place the wax around the figure and bend it to how it's going to need to be bent. So I have it bent now. Now I'm figuring out how I'm going to block it. I'll have to put blocks. You don't want to build this real solid because you're going to have to take the mold apart as you're building the mold. Now I'm just positioning the mold, figuring out where I'm going to glue it together. Okay, I think I have a good place to start. So I'm going to use hot glue right on the wax and right on the wood. First I'll glue the wood blocks to the board, and then the wax to the blocks. Okay, with the blocks glued in place, I'm ready to place the wax. Now I use a plastiline clay for a fillet material. So I'm filling it with the plastilina, and the best tools are clay tools to clean it up. That'll fill the little gaps that you can't get perfect with the knife. We call that a fillet. And I'm determining how and where I'm going to part this thing. I'm going to have a vertical flange coming up over half the head. So I have to position this. Now it has to be strong enough to withstand working. So I'm going to glue another block and put a vertical piece of wax. Now I glue the wax to the wood, and then I apply the fillet material to both the back and front side. Smoothing the fillet once again with the Bondo scraper. Now I step back from the mold, position it, and see if I can really separate that and pull that mold apart. I use my hands to kind of see how I'm going to pull it out of the, so I think I can do that. So it's working so far. Now it's important to pay attention to what they call the draft, which is the angle of the flange to the piece. The draft has to be able to pull apart from the other molds. So you don't want to get it below, I think 4%, 4% I think is the industry rules. In other words, you don't want that little half round shape to get locked in. There are two constrictions to pay attention to, constraints. That is the vertical constraint and the horizontal constraint. The vertical rising out of the mold has to be perpendicular so it doesn't lock, and also the horizontal has to be perpendicular to the form so it doesn't lock. Now to make the blanket of the mold, I take a little bit of plastilina clay, put a little bit of baby powder on a board, and make sure the clay is malleable and warm. And then I take a rolling pin and roll it out. The board has 2/4 inch slats so I can keep a uniform thickness to the clay. Now I'm making the blanket to the mold, and this is where having a rigid material, it really works to your advantage, so that there's no way I can damage or distort the mold, and no way I can make air pockets, because I can push that clay in nice and tight so there won't be any. If you have air pockets in your clay and you're trying to do a blanket mold, so you've done a beautiful detailed piece but there's air pockets in, this will certainly expose that air pocket and show up as a deformation in your wax. Very sad when that happens. I like a blanket mold because I can be economical as well as ensure excellent registration. The mold will stay tight, the flexible material will stay tight within the shell, and also I can control the amounts better, the thicknesses, by having engaged mold depth. Even it out And now clean up the surface of the mold. I use a little thinner paper towel to just keep those flanges clean. I'm now making registration keys for the flexible portion of the mold. Registration keys will help keep the mold in tight and in position. Since the rubber portion of the mold is flexible, you can make a slight undercut with the key depending upon what they call durometer, which is the softness or hardness of the mold. If you have a really hard durometer, you don't want to make too much of an undercut because you'll never get the keys back in, but a very soft durometer, you can always get those keys fitting in. Also with a little Vaseline or lubricant will fit into the mold. I am now adding the wax keys. The wax will pretty much stick to itself. A little bit of paint thinner underneath can help it stick, or you can use a little hot glue. Now to add a vertical key, and the rest of the mold will fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. I'm now adding outer keys so that there's an added advantage of holding the rubber into the mold. You can use any shape you want. You could use square. I like to have things kind of be pulled into place. Circles, you can do a pie cutter. Now I'm adding the spout to a place to pour the rubber in. This will eventually be all cut away. So spout is not a real critical thing. Now I'm going to be adding the fiberglass. I'm going to take some Cabasil and mix it into the fiberglass resin. And this will help the buildup around the edges. So I'll apply the Cabasil. And I'm using a little bit of loose chop with the Cabasil. This just aids in the strength of those keyed areas, but because of the chopped strand, you have to really get in there and work it out, and I use a roller to get that chopped strand and get all the bubbles out, and then I'll go ahead and add my chop mat. Now the vertical sections of the mold wall will of course take longer. The flange will take longer to glass because they're vertical and the fluid wants to fall out. I spend most of my time working on the flanges and let the case take care of itself. It'll be, by the time I get done with the flanges, it'll be covered thoroughly. Rolling out each layer so to get all the air out. I like to add about 5 coats of fiberglass to get these walls really thick. If there's one thing I've seen in the foundries when they make the fiberglass molds is they make the flanges too narrow and too thin. Give yourself plenty of room so that you get good registration. I can't emphasize enough that the most neglected part of the mold is the flange. Give yourself at least 3 to 4 inches of flange. You'll be trimming it later to give it the mold shape. Right now we want to just get those molds built up. Put about 4 or 5 coats of glass on the mold. Trim the excess glass so that the mold, the flange on the other side will be able to adhere to the mold wall perfectly. Okay, now you can get ready to peel the wax away from the flanges, and you'll want to remove the blocks around the side. Be sure not to dislodge the mold from the sculpture piece. Remove the blocks. And voila. Repeat these steps for the following sections, making sure that you have no interlocking components. The front will need at least 3 sections because of the complication of the figure, where the back will need 1 section. After the wax has been removed, you can remove it with paint thinner and a little bit of acetone. So those strong, smooth lines will provide easy mold separation. Now again, apply your fillet material. Cover your piece with saran wrap and blanket the work. Repeat the steps that you did in the first. Here I'm removing the wax again. When you see a flaw in your flange, it's not a bad idea to give it a little bit of a sanding. After all, you are after perfection, aren't you? Big sander just didn't quite get it enough, so now I put in my little 2-inch orbital sander. Beautiful little sander. Since I am going to be putting fiberglass onto fiberglass, I go ahead and I use the refinement wax parting material. I put it on both the wood and the fiberglass. No need to put it on the clay. Another added step is I use the pre-val system for applying the PVA. I can get a better coating with the PVA with the pre-val mister. And I make sure that all of the surfaces of the wood and the fiberglass are coated very well with the PVA. You want a good PVA coating. Again, notice I use a really thick wall flange. We don't want any deflection. Okay, now is the time that I trim the mold. I keep the flanges still about 3 inches and put the holes about 1.5 inches on center and every few inches. I'm having trouble determining where my cut line should be, so I'm holding a light up and I'm going to trace that line. So now I can start trimming that line. And after all this work, it's very satisfying to know that after you make your cut, you've got a nice thick flange that's going to interlock. At this point, I'm not worried about the bolts while I'm trimming because I know the pieces are going to hold together and not slip apart. If I was concerned that they'd be slipping apart, I would bolt it. Okay, I bolt it using 1/4 inch 20 nuts and bolts. I bolt down all but my first section that I'm going to pour, and then I'm going to pry loose. That's first section. See, I'm a little concerned with a little bit of an interlocking part of the mold, so you can see the concern on my face. I'm going, uh-oh. But I'm pretty confident I'll be able to separate it. But you can see I'm a little concerned. There's that concerned look on my face, like, oop, I messed up. If I can get this one separated, I know the whole thing will come apart. Might be slightly interlocking here, so that's what I'm concerned about. The drama continues. Now what I'm looking for are those little hairline cracks in the mold wall right around where I think it might be locking up. If I can't get those little hairline cracks to open up, then I have a locked mold. That's no good. Look, it's opening. Ah, yay. Okay, scratch the back of my head. That's a nervous tell. Tying my shoe. Okay, I know I got it. Now I'm relaxed. Okay. Now I go for another pry bar, starting to open it. See, I have that hairline crack down at the bottom. This will lift out just fine, particularly with the clay underneath. Now when I'm taking the wax out, this will be the last section I release so I don't bend any noses. This is critical. If I can get this off, I know I've made a good mold. There it goes. Got it off. Now I got to go ahead and clean the clay out of the shell and clean the seam lines. To get the clay out of the shell, you can heat the outside with a bit of a heat gun. That'll help pull the clay out. I will thoroughly clean the shell casing with paint thinner and acetone, and then I'll wax it and PVA it so that the urethane will not stick to it. I'm now drilling vent holes with about an 1/8 inch drill bit. I drill them along the keys, into all the keys, every single key, and along that outside key so that the liquid rubber will flow. See how I'm drilling lots of little vent holes? You cannot drill too many vent holes. I'm now cleaning the mold section and getting it ready for the PVA. I'm putting on my final wax, parting wax with Freeman parting wax, and cleaning it up with a fine brush. Oh, that's just the that's paint thinner. But I'll be applying the Freeman wax here soon. and a PVA on everything. Okay, I'm spraying the PVA on with the Preval. That means I've already had the Freeman wax. And I also use, it looks like I've got the universal mold release. I'm using the air to push around the PVA so that there's no lumps or drips, that it's entirely smooth, and let it dry thoroughly. Then I apply the universal mold release. I remove the clay from the mold casing and put it in the quart containers. That way I have an idea of how much rubber I need to pour it back into the mold. By volume, it's about the same. So for this section, you can see that I have almost 2 quarts of clay. Take the air out, and I'll bet you I have about 1.5 quarts is what I'll pour in, and I'll probably have excess too. So you can see how economical this is. After you've cleaned up the mold, sanded down some of the bumps and clean it up, and apply your wax sealer and PVA and universal mold release to the shell. This is the time to perfect the registration around the edges of the mold. Notice that this is a nice hardened copy, so I cannot gouge it. This will ensure a perfect registration. I have seen many mold makers go in there and gouge the original work out, and then they go in and try and repair, and you can always tell when a mold maker's gone in there to repair the work. This is where many a fight between the artist and the foundry occur. Again, apply the PVA sealer and assemble your case. This is where you want to go ahead and mark and drill all your vent holes so the rubber will flow without creating air pockets. Again, reemphasize, you cannot make too many vent holes. I like to seal the shell. I can, when I'm assembling it for the final pour, I use a quick dry latex caulking. You don't want the mold material to come in contact with moisture, so you want it to be quick dry within 20 minutes. Before pouring, I mix the part A and B with 5-gallon stir sticks. Pouring very well not to put air bubbles into the mixture and getting all the mixture off the bottom. Okay, I pour my part A and part B into separate containers. Now this is full, so it's going to be a little awkward here. And a little heavy. They do make spouts, and if you can get spouts for this, this would be a lot easier and a lot less wasteful. Okay, you see that I have about equal amount of urethane to clay. I might be making this mixture a little rich, but that's okay, it's fairly cheap. I mix it into a large container, and I want to make sure that I don't mix a lot of air bubbles into it. Now I pour the part A into the part B and mix thoroughly. Now I've pre-placed my clay. It'll be soft clay. And the higher you can hold this bucket up, the more it'll elongate and stretch the bubbles out. I don't worry about degassing because I know all the bubbles will flow to the top of the mold or out towards the surface and away from the mold itself. Now I look for the vent holes bleeding out, and then I'll fill them. Now the high ones bleeding out, I'll just let them bleed out, but the lower ones I'm going to want to start filling. I've made blanket molds as large as 7 feet tall and use this technique with flawless accuracy. The only thing is there's a lot more pressure on the vent holes. So what I have done in the past for those large, super large molds, I have a pot of hot wax. So when I covered the vent holes with the clay, I'll paint the vent holes over with hot wax, and that seems to have worked on those super large sectional molds. I'm wiping the mold down to see if there's any new urethane dripping out of the mold. That way I can tell if I've solved all my leaks, particularly since the mold's going to want to gravitate towards the bottom there, the flow. I want to make sure that I don't have any blowouts. And you can make sure that there's no blowouts by keeping an eye on the top tube and making sure that it doesn't lower. If the top tube lowers, then you better have some mold material ready to pour back in the mold. And you repeat the same process for the back side as the front side, except you won't be facing clay, you'll be facing urethane. You want to make sure that there's a good seal. You don't want anything to drip down in between the mold and your piece. So cleaning up is extremely important to get that wonderful registration that I'm talking about. And for the sake of repetition, I'm going ahead and spraying the pre-val. I must have already coated it with wax. It's very important to coat it with wax and get a good seal with the PVA. Let it thoroughly dry before pouring your urethane. Okay, and spraying again. The last step, the silicone universal mold release. And I'm pointing out where I have drilled all these vent holes into all the keys as well. I'm going to assemble it. Again, I'm applying the sealant to the outside of the holes. Look at those perfect mold walls. That's going to be a good mold. Again, it's all the same process for pouring the backside as well as the front. Pour a little bit, let those holes fill up the holes, and watch it where it drips out. Now we're separating the mold. This is where all this work is going to be worth the effort, or see if it's going to be a flaw. So let's see how the mold's going to open up. Always the moment of truth. I know that this outside piece is going to be the easiest to remove, so I start with that first. You always want to get a little crack, a little air crack. 99% of the time it is not stuck to itself, it's a vacuum. You've got to get air into the mold. It doesn't matter what type of mold, it's air that makes it stick 99% of the time. Using shims and pry bars, keep those shims going in all the way around the mold. You don't want to crack the flange. So there's another reason why you want a big, hearty, strong flange. Again, the moment of truth. You get that air going into the mold, and voila. Well, let's see, come on, separate. Perfection. Perfection.